Imagine being lost at sea for over a year with nothing. No landmarks, no food, no fresh water, just endless waves and the oppressive weight of the unknown. How would you survive? Here's how José Salvador Alvarenga did that. José Salvador Alvarenga was a simple fisherman, born and raised in the small coastal town of Garita Palmera in El Salvador. Fishing wasn't just his job, it was his way of life, a skill passed down through generations. Like many in his village, the sea was his second home, a place where he felt in control, capable, and confident. And then November 17th, 2012 began like any other. Alvarenga was preparing for what was supposed to be a routine fishing trip. He'd done this 1,000 times before. Set out early in the morning, haul in as much fish as possible, and return home by sunset. On this particular day, Alvarenga wasn't alone. He was joined by a 22-year-old novice fisherman named Ezequiel Cordoba. Despite his inexperience, Cordoba was eager to learn the trade, and Alvarenga was happy to show him the ropes. Their vessel was a small, open-top fiberglass boat, just 7 meters long and equipped with an outboard motor. It was for short, day trips along the coast, enough to make a decent catch and head back to shore. The weather was fine as they set out, but as any fisherman knows, the ocean is unpredictable. As they ventured further from shore, the skies began to darken and the wind picked up. Before they knew it, they were caught in a violent storm. The waves grew taller, crashing against their tiny boat with relentless force. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets. For hours, they battled the elements, trying to keep the boat afloat and on course, but it was no use. The outboard motor sputtered and died. The storm had pushed them far from the coast into the vast expanse of the Pacific. They had no way to navigate, no way to signal for help, and no idea where they were. They had set out with only enough provisions for a day or two, and now those supplies were running dangerously low. Their initial hope of being rescued quickly faded as they watched the sun rise and set over the endless waves day after day, with no sign of another boat or land in sight. The ocean had become their prison. Alvarenga and Cordoba knew they had to survive, but how? They would have to fend for themselves. They began catching fish with their bare hands, using whatever they could find, pieces of debris, clothing, even their own nails, to create makeshift tools. They ate the fish raw. As the weeks dragged on, their situation grew more desperate. They caught and ate whatever they could. Birds that landed on the boat, small turtles that swam by, even jellyfish when there was nothing else. But the lack of fresh water was the real killer. They tried to catch rainwater when they could, but during dry spells they were forced to drink their own urine just to stay alive. Their bodies began to wither, and their minds too began to falter under the weight of their predicament. The days blended into each other, the sun rising and setting in an endless cycle as they drifted aimlessly across the Pacific. By this time, the strain of survival in such extreme conditions was beginning to show, especially on Ezequiel Cordoba. Unlike Alvarenga, who was hardened by years of fishing, Cordoba was less experienced and less equipped to deal with the unrelenting harshness of their situation. One day, after consuming a raw bird that they had managed to catch, Cordoba fell gravely ill. The bird's flesh was perhaps contaminated or simply too raw for his weakened state. His condition rapidly deteriorated. Despite Alvarenga's best efforts to care for him, it was clear that Cordoba was slipping away. After weeks of watching his friend suffer, Alvarenga awoke one morning to find Cordoba lifeless beside him. The loss was a crushing blow. Alvarenga was now utterly alone in the middle of an unforgiving ocean. In the days following Cordoba's death, the solitude was almost unbearable. He considered giving up, letting the sea claim him as it had his friend. To cope with the overwhelming grief and isolation, Alvarenga did something many might find unthinkable. He began talking to Cordoba's corpse. In his mind, he couldn't bear to let go of the last connection to another human being, even if that person was no longer alive. He kept Cordoba's body on the boat for 6 days, speaking to it as if his friend could hear him, trying to keep the crushing loneliness at bay. But eventually, the reality of the situation forced him to act. The body began to decompose in the brutal heat, and Alvarenga knew he had to let it go. With a heavy heart, he pushed Cordoba's body overboard. Now, Alvarenga was truly alone. The hallucinations that had plagued him before Cordoba's death intensified. He began to see things that weren't there. Ships on the horizon, LA,